Hello guys, welcome to another chess lesson. We're going to be looking at checkmate in one. So by now you should have understood what the word checkmate means, right? So we're going to be looking at checkmate in just one move. The game is going to come to an end. Now the question is, what move is going to be the best, right? And when you're trying to solve this kind of positions, now we're not doing just the king and rook maybe versus the king, or king and two rooks. Now we're looking at a bunch of pieces again in the position, so we have to also be careful of where we're going to be moving to, right? But one of the first things that you want to do when trying to do the checkmate in one, or when trying to understand the checkmate in one, right, is firstly you want to, right, look for all the possible checks that can happen in your position, or in the position that you're solving, right? Now let's take a look at this position. There are a lot of checks that can happen, right? You want to look at all the possible checks. Now the first thing is looking at all the possible checks, but how are you going to do that? You want to look at all of the pieces that are around. First of all, you want to look at where your opponent's king is, right? When you spot your opponent's king, the next thing that you want to do is you want to look for all the possible checks, the pieces that are around the king, sometimes even far, but you're going to start with all the officers that are close to the king and all the pieces that can do the check. Right now you could even start from left to right, right? You could start with, okay, can this pawn do a check? No, the answer is no, right? Because the pawn can just move forward. Can this rook do a check? And you remember how the rook moves, right? So you look at all the possible squares the rook can move to, and you're going to see that the rook can move here to e8. This is a check. And also to d4. This is a check, right? Now you don't even need to start calculating or even doing anything. You still want to look at all the checks, right? Now the next piece that we're going to look at is with the queen. Now there are a lot of checks you can do with the queen. There's like there are a lot of checks, right? So for the start, you want to look at every single check in the position, right? And there's a reason for that, right? Because sometimes eventually when you become a little bit more, when you advance, right, you're going to now start seeing some awkward moves that are eventually going to still be correct. So when you're looking for the checkmate for the start, right, you want to look at all the possible checks. At some point your mind is going to be able to just filter the ones that just looks off by just looking at the position, and they call that intuition. So for the start, just look at all the possible checks. Now this queen has like this is going to be a check, this is going to be a check, this is going to be a check, this, and even this, right? And this also, this also is going to be a check, this also is going to be a check. So there are a lot of check. Now we've looked at all the possible checks for the queen, and lastly the pawn is also going to do a check, right? So but now you can see there are lots of check. Now we're going to start with the first ones that we looked at. Now remember, when you're doing a checkmate, you want to make sure that, okay, after the check, your opponent has no square to go, because that's why it's a checkmate. And the first move these are the two possible squares we can do the check with the rook. Now the question is, we're looking for a checkmate in one. So if our opponent's king has a square to move to, then it's not going to be a checkmate. Now let's look at this move, because this was the first. Now if we go check over here, the king has a square that he can run to, and it's simple. The king can just move up here, right? Because this rook was stopping the king from moving into this file, into the d file, right? So moving the rook out now attacks this file, but this file now is not being controlled by white, except for just some few squares, which is this square and this square by the queen, right? So this other squares are not being controlled by white anymore, and black's king can just simply hop into the squares that are not being under attack, right? So going here, the king has a square to move to. Now the next move was rook here, right? And rook to d4 is going to be a checkmate, right? The question is, where can the king move to after rook goes to d4, right? The king cannot move here because the rook is still guarding that that square, that's file, sorry, right? The king cannot move here, neither can the king move here, right? it's the rook is controlling this whole line. Now, can the king move forward? Right, the king cannot move forward, right, because of the pawn. The pawn is controlling this square, and the king can move forward. Can the king go here? Sorry, no. Can the king go move towards this side? That's after rook check. The answer is no, because this queen is also controlling this file, and he can't also move up. So every single square the king can move to is being attacked by one of our pieces, right? And this makes this move a checkmate, right? Every other move again that we looked at, which was queen here, it's just going to be bad. Now, there's a reason I said you should look at all of them, right? Because you're just going to quickly just understand eventually, right, which kind of pieces, or like the direction that you should be looking at, right? Now, in this position, it's going to just be not good if you just consider this move, right? It's not, considering is not that, it's not bad if you consider it, right? But playing it is now going to be bad, because just queen here, he just takes, and we're looking for a move that ends the game. So we want to play a move that black cannot respond to eventually, right? So taking this is just going to be a blunder. Going here, the king can take, the bishop can take, right? So every other possible check is just going to be bad with the queen, right? If we go here, the bishop can take. If we go here, the rook can take. If we go here, the rook can just simply block, and it's no longer a checkmating one, right? So when you're doing the checkmating one, first of all, look at all the pieces around your king, right? Remember, I said you can start from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, right? To all this side. So you're going to be like, okay, can this pawn do a check? No, right? The pawn can't do a check because the pawn moves forward, right? The king is over here. Now, can this pawn do a check? No. Can the king? I'm just kidding. You all know the king cannot attack a king, right? So the next piece that we're looking at is this knight. Can this knight do a check, right? The answer is yes, the knight can do checks here and here. Now, lastly is the pawn. Can this pawn do a check? No, the pawn is not Superman, right? So the knight can do a check. Now, the question is, where is going to be a checkmate? Remember, we're not just looking for a check, we're looking for checkmates. So the question is, what squares are eventually going to result into the position being in a checkmate? Now, the first move, let's say we decide to go here, right? And this is a check. Can the king move anywhere? Now, we know that the king cannot move here because of the pawn, cannot move here because of our king, right? The king is in an opposition right now. You are already supposed to know what opposition is by this lesson. So this king cannot move here because of the pawn attacking e4, right? So after this check, where is the king gonna go then? The king can go to e3, and if the king goes to e3, it's not a checkmate one. Now let's look at the other check, right? Knight to d5, right? Knight to d5, king cannot go here, king cannot go here, because now the knight is attacking this square and also attacking the king, right? So this is going to be the checkmate. Now, another reason is very important to always consider all the possible checks that will happen in the position, is because if you consider all the possible checks, your answer is definitely going to be in one, right? So if you can't find a checkmate in one puzzle, right, it means that you didn't consider all the possible checks, right? So right now we have a queen. Remember, start from left to right. So let's not go against that rule. Now, the pawn, can the pawn do a check? No, because the pawn moves forward, and if we go here, we're only attacking this square, not the king. Can this rook do a check? Now, there's no possible way this rook can do a check on this king, right? So this is also cancelled. The king, no. The pawn, now we have a pawn over here, right? The pawn can move this way, so this pawn move is a check, right? So this is one move that we can consider also. Now, we've looked at this pawn is just blocked by its own pawn, right? So we can't even move the pawn. So let's more of doing a check, right? Now, lastly, the queen. Can this queen do a check? Yes, there are lots of squares this queen can do a check. There's this, right? There's this, right? There's this. There is also this. There's also this, right? And what other square? Am I missing any square? I think that's all of the squares that the queen can do a check, right? So the question is, what happens now? We start canceling out the ones that So let's look at the pawn first, right? We can start looking at the pawn first. Now that you've identified all the checks, you start looking at the pawn. If pawn takes, now this pawn is not protected. So if pawn takes check, the queen can actually just take, and we are on the check right now, right? So that's going to be a problem, right? So if pawn takes, the queen can just take back. Even the king can also take back, right? So but the queen taking back is much more better, because now the rook is going to be hanging also, right? So aside pawn takes check, sorry, aside pawn take on g5, now there's no any other check with the pawn, so we're going to look at the queen. So queen goes here. We already see that the rook is on this line, so we're just going to lose our queen. So we're just going to lose our queen, yes. Now if the queen goes here, the rook can also still block, and it's not a checkmate you want. Remember, you're looking for a move that your opponent cannot respond to. Now the other check that we looked at is here, and if we go here, okay, the king is on the check, can't move forward because of our pawn again, right? And his pieces are like pretty much an obstruction and stopping him from moving, right? So right now, if we go here, he cannot move here also because of our pawn. And this is going to be a checkmate because the king cannot get close to the queen, right? Because the queen is attacking in all directions, right? So if we bring our queen over here, this is going to be a checkmate because the king can go here, here, or here, and neither here or here. And these are the only possible squares he can move to. So this is a checkmate, right? So again, always consider all the possible checks that can happen in the position. Once you consider all the possible checks that can happen in the position, then you now start looking for the ones that work. If you can't still find the ones that work, just eliminate the ones that just look obvious that it's not a checkmate. Like for instance, the ones that you know that he's just going to capture you, right? So in this position, from left to right, we only have the king and queen. So in this position, the king cannot do a check, so it's only the queen. Now we're looking for all the possible checks the queen can do. Now this is an open position, so there's going to be a lot of checks, so you have to look at it carefully. Now there's going to be a check. Let's look at this line. The only square that connects the king is this square, so there's going to be a check over here. Now let's look at going this way. Now there's no attack on the king over here or here or here or here, right? So now let's look forward. Now we have a check over here, we have a check over here, and we have a check over here, right? So it means that in this position there's going to be a check here, here, and here, right? Now remember, the queen also moves like the bishop, so we're going to look at, consider it's moving like the bishop, right? So along this line it can do a check over here. Along this line it can do a check over here, and not here. So let's adjust that. So this and this is going to be a check. And lastly, along this line, can it do a check? No, it doesn't have any check. So these are the possible squares that the king can do a check. And now we know that if we do a check over here, now let's look at it one by one. Going check here, does the king has any square to move? Now the king cannot capture because the opponent's king is protecting. We can't go here also because there's a queen, right? So we cannot go here or here because of the queen also. So what are we going to play as black? Now our only good square is just moving backwards, and this is not a checkmate one, so this is cancelled. Now going here is just out of the equation because the pawn, queen, and king can all capture, right? You're just going to fist on the queen. So going here also is not going to be a checkmate, right? Going here is not going to be a checkmate because he just moved into this file. And then while you're looking for a check, you're now going to see, okay, you know that this is the only square, like the king can move towards this side of the board, so you need a move that stops him from moving towards this side. And if you keep on looking for the checks, right, you go here, you see that he moves here, but what happens now if you go here, right? This is not going to be this is going to be a checkmate, sorry, right? Because after the queen goes to d5, the king cannot go here because of the queen, cannot go here because of the queen, cannot go here because of the queen, cannot move backwards because of the queen, right? The queen is just going to get the king, and now it's going to be a checkmate because the king cannot also move up because we are in opposition. Whenever you're in opposition, your opponents cannot move forward, right? Your opponent cannot move forward because it now brings the king close, and that's not a possible position that can arise in a chess game, right? So this is just going to be checkmate, right? So once you solve, I would advise you to solve like at least 100 of these puzzles, right? Once you can solve 100 of these puzzles, by just looking at the position, you're just going to know instantly all the possible checks. Now, still in this position, this one is a little bit tricky. So if you are not looking at it carefully, you might struggle if you're a complete beginner. Now, right now, look at all the possible checks again. Start from left to right. The pawn, can the pawn do a checkmate? No. Can this pawn do a check or checkmate? No. Now, can this queen do a check? Now, the queen has a lot of scope. So you look at all these possible squares the queen can move to. And the answer is yes, it can do a check over here, here, and here, right? Next is the knight. This knight is too short and can't reach the king. Next is the rook. The rook is blocked by its own pieces, so can't do a check. This bishop is also blocked by its own pieces, can't do a check. This pawn, no. This pawn, no. This pawn, no. Right, so you're going to see that all of the pieces cannot do a check, only the queen. And in this position, it means that a queen move is going to give you a checkmate, and it's either between these three. Now, going here, you just know that the knight is attacking and the bishop is attacking, so this is just automatically going to so this move is just going to be cancelled immediately because of this knight takes or bishop takes. Now, the next one you want to look at is going here. Now, going here, you're allowing the king to move this way, right? So it's not going to be a checkmate. And last move that you're going to consider is just going here. And you're going to see that after you go here, the king cannot move out because we have our queen there, and cannot still go here because our queen is going to be over here and cannot capture its own piece. So obviously this is going to be the move that does the checkmate. So when you're starting off, when you're just starting off and you're trying to understand, right, and you're trying to understand checkmate in ones, the first things that you want to look at is you want to scan from left to right all the possible pieces that can do checks, right? But once you solve a lot of puzzles, it's just going to, I don't know how to explain, but it just becomes part of you. You just immediately start seeing checkmates that can happen, right? You just going to not consider this because you already know that this pawns can do a check. So, but for the start, remember, always consider all of the pieces from left to right. Start with this, and this. Now, this pattern, definitely an amateur is not going to be watching how to do a checkmate in one. So if you're an amateur, just vamoose from here, right? So this is for people that are just starting out, right? And people that have not actually looked at this before starting to play games, right? So in this position, how many checks? Can this pawn do a check? No. This pawn do a check? No. This rook do a check? No. This pawn do a check? No. This bishop, the king is on a light square, so the bishop on the dark square never attack the king, right? And this pawn, no. This pawn, no. The king, no. The pawn, but the queen can do a check. Now the question is, what are the possible checks the queen can do? This is 1, this is 2, and this is 3. Now among these 3, 1 is going to be the best. Now going here is going to just be an attack on the king. Check. Can he move here? The answer is no, because of the bishop, right? And this is another reason why you have to look at all the possible checks, because by the time you now look at all the possible pieces and whether they can do a check or not, you're going to automatically just start seeing their scope, and in a way it's going to give you an idea of what can happen, right? So let's say you got to this rook and let's say you got to this bishop and you just saw the bishop is eyeing the king side but can't do a check. You're just going to see eventually that there's some squares that are connected, and now you can move your queen here, even though that is not going to be a checkmate, but it's just going to give you an idea of what can happen, right? So going here, you're going to see that the king cannot go here because the bishop is going to be attacking this diagonal. So queen to g6 is going to be a checkmate, right? And like I said, you want to do a lot of these puzzles, right? You want to do a lot of these puzzles. Start from left. Now, if you just start looking at the queen in this position, you're going to be like, okay, my queen is hanging. Is there any brilliant sack? No, there's not going to be any brilliant sack. Again, start from the left hand side all the way to the right hand side. This pawn cannot do a check. This pawn cannot do a check. This bishop, right? Draw the scope of the bishop with your mouse, and you're going to see that the bishop can actually do a check over here, right? So just mark this as 1 check. The next one is the pawn. The next one is the rook. Nope, both of them can't do a check. This pawn cannot do a check, can only take this. Next is the queen. The queen can do a lot of checks. Taking this is going to be a check. Going here is going to be a check. Going here is going to be a check. This rook cannot do a check. This pawns cannot do a check. So you have options of 1, right, 2, right, 3, 4. So there are 4 possible moves, and remember, any move that you're looking at, your opponent has to have no response to it. Now let's just cancel the ones that just looks obvious that our opponent has response to. This, we know the queen can just capture backwards, right? This, we know that the king or rook can capture. This, we know that the queen is attacking this, so he can just follow us where we're going to go. And now you're going to be left with this, and now you can see this piece is far from the king side, but it's actually the piece doing the checkmate, right? Now you want to solve a lot of these puzzles, right? At least 100. And one of the ways you can solve these puzzles is when you go to Lichess, right? You want to put your mouse on puzzles, right? Go to puzzle teams and then just scroll upwards, and you're going to see mate in 1. Just click on this and try to solve 100 puzzles, right, in this mate in 1 positions. And when you're done, right, when you are done, then you can move on to the next one, to the next video, which is going to be mate in 2. All right, thank you.